Welcome to Some Things Considered, the podcast where we are obsessed with story. We celebrate creativity and we talk to cool people to find out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I'm an author. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University, and I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. For more about me and what I do, check out seanmurphy.net. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Some Things Considered. This is the podcast where we are obsessed with story, we celebrate creativity, and we talk to cool people to figure out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I direct the Story Center at Shenandoah University. I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. I'm a writer. You can find out more about me at seanmurphy.net. But the purpose of this podcast is to shine the light on others. And one of the things I savor in the various roles I have is I get to interact with amazing human beings. And it's never not inspiring to talk to them, especially about creative stuff. So one of them is with me now. Our special guest today is the one and only Brian Broome. Let me read you his bio and then we'll jump in. Brian's debut memoir, Punch Me Up to the Gods, was a New York Times editor's pick and winner of the 2021 Kirkus Prize for Nonfiction. He's a contributing columnist at Washington Post. He was a K. Leroy Irvis Fellow and instructor at the writing program at the University of Pittsburgh. He's been a finalist in the Moth Storytelling Competition and won the grand prize in Carnegie Mellon's Martin Luther King Writing Awards. And as we'll talk about, his Facebook feed, if you're lucky enough to be on it, is the best read on the internet. Brian, it's great to see you. It's been a while. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm excited to talk to you.
Well, I'm excited. I've been excited. And it's like, we were hot and heavy in 2021. I had you on my dance card. You were kind enough to talk to me for the author series before and after your memoir dropped. And that was cool because we got to see this excitement of the buildup and then the anticipated and very welcome and deserved accolades. And then we did the 1455 interview. Since your memoir dropped, you've been a busy man. I've followed you with great enthusiasm. And your journey, as we'll talk about, has inspired me and a lot of others in terms of the craft of writing, the craft of memoir. But if I'm to be honest, I feel like both of our literary careers are just a delivery device so I can follow you on Facebook. That is a constant highlight. So we'll get into all that. But one of the things I wanted to talk to you about specifically on this podcast with a book of my own coming out is this notion of we write about a lot of stuff. But I think if I were to have the audacity to compare myself to you in any way, I think a lot of what we write about circles around issues of maleness, male toxicity, and we're both from an older school. So I think we have a purview of how it used to be, how it is, and how it should be. Is that a fair assessment? I know you write about a lot of other things, but this notion of maleness and kind of interrogating it really suffuses both of the things we focus on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's totally fair. I think that my book is kind of driven by that. And the ideas around like maleness, what it's supposed to be, like what we're taught it is, and like, yeah, even as importantly, what we're taught that it isn't, you know? And literally every day, like I come across something um with regard to like this idea of being male and what it's supposed to entail that I have to like question like every single day, whether it's with myself or with other men. Like, I also teach much younger people, so I see how things are changing and how things are staying the same. So definitely fair. Like, and I talk to a lot to my friends who are women, and what they come up against in this idea of like, maleness. I mean, heterosexual women, most
Yeah.
often,
Yeah.
telling me about like relationships and walls they have to sort of break down in order to become closer to their partners, and just a lot of the codes that were given, from birth, really, that seep their way into our bones and keep us, and I think prevent us from being our authentic selves sometimes, also from experiencing life fully sometimes. Yeah, so it's a fascination of mine, definitely.
Yeah, and so I would be remiss to not say always trying to see the glass at least half full. The fact that we as artists are in dialogue and in academia and in society talking about the fact that we have a term for male toxicity or talking about it at all certainly signals some progress. I think the onus is on us that are in a classroom or writing and reaching audiences to make sure it's clear we have a lot of work to do, but at least the dialogue is happening, whether it's happening satisfactorily, who is being authentic, how we encourage authenticity. To me, I fall back on we're having these dialogues, and that's good. But we've got a lot of work to do. You bring up the notion of authentic selves, and I think for me that tees up one of the things I'm obsessed with. I direct this story center at Shenandoah University. And it's really an initiative. There's a lot to it, but one of the things that's like the soapbox I get on is that if we break things down fundamentally, like never mind art, everything's story. So whether we're talking about political campaigns, how shoes are sold in the media, how magazine articles are written, that's story. And up until recently, I think you and I would both agree, like the notion of what is a man, and you talk about this so wonderfully in your memoir, is we're constructed and there's a societal construct. So we're not just responding to how other dudes act. We're talking about really deeply ingrained narrative in American culture.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Like, it all just kind of like fits together. And you mentioned like, there's a lot of work to do. There's so many interconnected things. I think about my father a lot. Um, and how he believed that his only function in life was to work, right? Like
Yeah.
he didn't really parent. He wasn't really kind of available emotionally, for me. Like he was taught that his only function within the household, it was to work and work all the time. And I thought, isn't that handy? Like, isn't that handy when you think about like capitalism, to have like a society full of men who believe that their only real value is to just work, you know? And it
Yeah.
fits in so well with like, he's making money so that he can make somebody else richer, who can make somebody else richer. So, it's up this idea of challenging masculinity and what it means. It comes up against a lot of like, obstacles, you know. If and when my father lost his job, like he really believed he fell into a depression, although there was no name for it at the time,
Right.
you know
Yeah.
like he just started acting weird. He would like lay around all day, and he felt like he had no purpose.
Right.
um so, and this idea of like being, and it fits in with patriarchy and all these things that we believe, or we've been taught to believe, make our society function you
Yeah.
know and I
Yeah.
listen to a lot of like, um right-wing types,
Yeah.
who are talking about, we're losing masculinity, but we're not losing masculinity. What they're afraid of is that we're losing patriarchy.
That's
And those two things don't necessarily have to be like, they're not enmeshed. Like masculinity is one thing, patriarchy is another thing. So yeah, I think that, when we start, the fact that we're having these conversations, and it really is just at its beginning stages,
right. Right.
that it's even being addressed, more broadly, because the kids in my class know about it. You know,
Right.
they are, and I think they are trying to, they're just starting to like, ask questions about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think basically what you just said. I mean, I always am happy to going back to grad school, in the different century. I'm very cognizant of where I locate myself as like a straight white male. So the privilege, the perception, the perspective, all of these diverse voices that, we still have as a literary industry, as a culture, so much work to do. And we can do that work. But one of the things I'm fascinated by, and you touched on it, is if we peel back some layers of identity, all of which should be explored, the more voices, the better, the more, awareness we can raise in terms of stories being told. But I think you get at the root of patriarchy, which is it's a very capitalist. People are making money. This is not a natural state of affairs. The notion
No.
of the man being silent and tough and not showing feelings and working and not missing work, because that is validated. So even if you're sick, go to work. There's somebody making money on that. I'm really glad you brought that up because it's not to minimize whatsoever the notion of we need black voices, we need female voices, we need gay voice, all of the above. But I think all of us would do better, especially talking to students, to peel back a little bit and go, what are the real mechanisms behind all of this dysfunction? And usually there's a dollar sign at the end of that
Oh
tunnel.
yeah. Oh yeah. You know, I forget who told me this, and I regret forgetting who it was. And I think it was somebody at like one of my I go to like AA and NA meetings, and when I first started going, somebody said to me, "Be careful of anybody who tries to tell you what life is all about. Like, be wary of anybody who tries to tell you what life is all about." Bet we be that like a religious, person or an older person, whatever, because that person has learned from another person to serve something else, you know. So when you talk about like, somebody who has gone to work their whole life and never missed a day, sure, that's admirable, but like, was that person happy? Like,
Yeah,
did that person get to know their children? Did that person like experience that vacation that they wanted to take? Did that person live? You know,
yeah,
or there are people who have died and on their tombstone never missed a day of work, and I'm like, I don't know that that's like necessarily admirable in and of itself,
that's right.
So, my father, as I say, thought his life was about, and the two things were interconnected. He worked, he made the money, and therefore that actually, fed into his insecurities, and there were many, because if he had the power in the house, my mother couldn't leave, you know my
Right,
mother couldn't have a say. My mother had to do what he said, and that's in the end kind of what he really wanted you know um and so that's what I'm talking about. These things are so interconnected. you
yeah,
know Patriarchy is about controlling women. There's nothing else that it's about.
yeah,
And capitalism feeds into it, and religion feeds into it, and so you're battling a lot of different things when when you start questioning like what you know masculinity is for. And as I say, masculinity and patriarchy aren't the same thing. you know
right,
you can
right.
be masculine without being patriarchal. you
Yeah.
know
Yeah, and you can be a feminist without being a woman, et cetera. It's like there's just the different layers of engagement and advocacy, and but it all starts with awareness. But it also starts with what I think a lot of art is trying to do, and it's the notion of cultivating an empathy, and in the literal sense of what empathy entails and what it means, and how that's extremely frightening for people in positions of power in the patriarchy. And I think specifically, and I'd love your take, being in the classroom, and we can kind of compare notes. I'm for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's just my own sensibility, but I'm extremely bullish on Gen Z and the millennials. I think they've been in so many ways ill-served by our culture and society. Never mind, the ascension of the digital toys that, for better or worse, we didn't get to enjoy, but we also didn't get to be distracted by. But if I were to boil it down, and we never want to reduce things, but I would say on one hand, these generations, these younger generations, have the empathy and sensitivity that we absolutely lacked and didn't understand. But I think inevitably that's resulted in a certain anxiousness and fragility that no one is helping them deal with. So what I hear a lot of, Brian, is people saying, "Oh God, the new generation, they're not accountable, they're babies, they're sissies." And it's like, look what we've dumped on them. And yet they still are way more empathetic, way better human beings. Talk to me about what you see in the classroom, and if you agree with that, or what else you're seeing that I'm not articulating.
well, I mean, I know that this you bring up this idea of like fragility. And, I recognize sometimes, that when I'm confronted with something, my own insensitivity, I get angry at the person who has confronted me. Like when I've said something that is, not funny, but was funny when I was, 25. um i I recognize, okay, this is like, I try to recognize anyway, okay, this is a generational thing that I am not understanding. I mean, first of all, we have to address the fact that every generation thinks that the generation that comes after it is weak and soft and, and pampered, and, so let's just deal with that first
Yeah.
of all.
Yeah.
um but what I'm seeing in the classroom, I still see boys that are uncomfortable, you know, with their feelings. I did a whole section on writing. I teach creative writing, so did a whole section on interiority, that, yeah, that big fancy, MFA word.
Yeah.
When we talk about writing about our feelings and what's going on like internally. And I said to the class, like, who's bad at interiority? And every hand went up. They were like, boys, dudes, like guys. And and that's kind of a door that opens that into like, okay, let's talk about that. Like, why? And all of the young men in my classrooms are like, because we are told that we are not allowed to show feelings and we don't know how to do it. And and I'm like, that's not going to be an issue here. Write what you want to write how you feel. And they are very, very much open to it. The idea that we are raising, a sort of like weak generation. And, when I hear people complaining about it, they're telling me, two things. They're telling me, one, and this sounds really simplistic, but they're telling me things are not like they were when I was young. They're not going to be, you know. Um, and they're telling me that that makes them uncomfortable. Um, and and I try to tell people who say that to me, like, you sound like your parents. You sound like your parents when they were talking to you. How do you not see that? No,
Right.
no, no, but these kids are weaker. They're
Yeah.
they're more fragile. Like, you sound, no matter how you try to justify it,
Yeah.
you know, you sound like your parents. So what I'm seeing is, again, a new knowledge of the fact that, we genderize like behavior. um, I'm seeing um, I'm seeing a generation of young women who are changing, and a generation of young men who are frustrated by the fact that women are changing. You know, this is where we get the incels and the young men who just cannot, who believe that women owe them something. You know, who believe that if they cannot get a woman to love them or have sex with them, that that's the woman's fault. That they don't have to do any work on themselves. They are just supposed to automatically get a woman because that's what women are supposed to do. I also see, some unfortunately some women who still, young women who still believe that,
Mhm.
and who will change themselves and bend themselves into unnatural shapes in order to have, a boyfriend. I'm seeing that less and less,
Yeah.
but what I'm seeing mostly is young men who don't know how to behave. There's statistics about how many young men are not going to college anymore. Not that going to college is some, like, thing that you should do,
Right.
but what I'm saying is, like, there's studies now that, young men are kind of like aimless, um,
Yeah.
and don't know what to do. And I think that's because the I'm talking like, maybe straight young men. They don't know how to be in the world anymore, you know. And I see a lot of anxiety around them. I had a young man tell me, like, all he did, you know, in high school was like play video games because he could just get lost in the video game and didn't have to think about how to be in the world and didn't have to think about interacting with, women and like all that stuff. And I think there's a lot of that going on.
Mhm.
Young women are changing by leaps and bounds. Young men are changing extremely slowly, and that creates a rift, in how people are supposed to behave. That's the sort of downside of it. We're not having these conversations fast enough.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah. Well, that makes me think of two things. First of all, to get back to the whole notion of story with a capital S and culture and society, there is of course, very cynical and opportunistic group that are seizing on these incels and these frustrated, inarticulate men and saying, "You're right. The world and the liberals are trying to bring you down." So there's that cynicism that we need to not only kind of battle but make people aware and do a better job as liberals of explaining, the people behind the curtain.
Yeah.
But the other thing I'm curious if you've noticed, and I want to be very careful, like it's a very broad generalization, but I certainly mean it in a very positive kind of socio-political, anthropological lens, which is when I was in high school, and I think again, you and I are from a similar generation, I mean, the quiet, artsy, um, possibly gay men were, picked on. They were outcast. They were, quieted by bullies, by teachers that didn't even think there was anything wrong with bullying. And what I've seen in the classroom, and I love it, is many of these same types of people, again, of obviously generalizing, but those that are more artistically inclined, those that are more in touch with their feminine side or more in touch with their sensitivity, are very heard and very encouraged. And I mean, I think that's all to the good. What concerns me a bit is it's not a complete role reversal, but it's the more stoic, maybe athletic, kind of quiet, firm boys that would have prospered in a different generation are the more shy, retiring, unwilling to speak out. And rather than kind of celebrate, well, it's about time, there is some of that. But it concerns me because these are the people we're getting lost, that are filtering away and are susceptible to the aforementioned cynics that are like, we got you in the MAGA movement. We understand this anger. And no, that doesn't lead anywhere good.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that it's different for me. I think I don't know anything about what's going on in high schools. I do understand that there is progress there as far as what you said, like the boys who are more artistic and more inclined to not be all rough and tough are being heard. I do think there's some of that going on, but I also just I think it depends where you are, you know. I think the thing that was going on back in the 1930s when we were in high school, is
I
still
see what you
going
did
on.
there.
Yeah, is still going on in small town America. I think, there the jock who prospered back then is still prospering now in some places. Although and so I don't want to lose sight of that.
Yep.
But I think what's happening is if that jock leaves that town, he finds out very quickly that, it's not the same ball game like in the world.
Right.
Um, so I do think that certain people are being heard more, but I don't know that the bullying is has dissipated. But you're right. When that jock leaves town and he can't make headway and the world isn't falling at his feet because of his masculinity, like he is a prime target for the people who are saying like you're right, it's the women's fault, we create misogynists every day, it's the women's fault, it's the liberals fault, when in fact what is happening is what's been happening since the beginning of time. The culture is changing. The culture is changing, and this is probably the first time the culture has changed in a way that doesn't necessarily include them. Well, not, I shouldn't say include them, embrace them.
That's right.
um, and they don't like it. They don't like it. And and not, it sounds like I'm switching topics here, but like, when I had a conversation with a woman the other day, and she and her husband have just gone through a divorce, and it's amicable but testy as divorces can be. And she was like, I don't really think he knows how to love. We were talking about masculinity and
Right.
in the context of masculinity, and she was like, I don't think he knows what love actually is. Like, I think he thinks it that he loves me, but all he really wants is to control me. And that's what he thinks love is, you
Yeah.
know? And her point was like, he only ever wanted me when I wasn't there, and she was like, that's not love, that's control. And I think there are a lot of men who walk around thinking that they love someone when their love is so conditional on control, um, that it creates just this toxicity, and it creates a lot of the dangers that women face today. Like, you cannot swing a dead cat without seeing a murder show about some guy whose wife was trying to leave because she was unhappy. And like, you know in my own personal life, I had a friend who, when I first started going to a
Mhm.
woman was, and I wrote about this for Men's Health magazine. Like, I befriended a woman who was coming to AA, and she was there because she was a nurse, and she was busted because she's failed the drug test, so they made her come. But during the time she was there, it came out that she and her husband used drugs together, and like they had this really kind of like insular relationship where she never left the house, and and she was like his financial support as well. Anyway, long story short, she comes to AA and like starts to realize all this, decides to leave him,
Yeah.
and he shot her dead. you know and this is when you really have to think, like, what is wrong with men, right? you know of course, you have to say there are lots of men who are having these conversations and don't engage in these kinds of behaviors, but it still is a problem that persists, like, in our gender, in our sex, excuse me, like, that we have these kinds of men, who don't understand the nature of love or empathy.
I thank you for that, Brian. And I think you just dropped at least two really beautiful nuggets that could be further explored. This notion of people that don't know, men who don't know how to love. But I think the real mic drop there, that I think is uncontestable, is the notion of whether you cut across socioeconomic, race, even time, and what is the one thing that causes most men anxiety and to lash out, and it's not having control of their women, not having control of their job, not having control of their own emotions. This notion of control I think the powerful, like, that's everything.
Yeah.
And I think our jobs is to how to wrestle with that on a real kind of both fundamental and mature level, and recognize with empathy that some of these men have been put in positions. It doesn't excuse their actions, but when we see these forces threatening their control, the impulse is to lash out. And then we have people, whether it's in religion, politics, business world. Look at who some of the most rich people are right now. They're bullies, and they're giving voice to these people and saying, "You damn right, you should lash back." And they're lashing back at the wrong people, arguably.
Yeah, absolutely. And this notion of control is scary because life is pretty chaotic,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
and and I think the bullies at the top that you mentioned, they want to secure their position. So what they do is they have other men who are essentially minions,
yeah.
kind of do the dirty work for them,
Right.
keep women under control, don't question gender, don't question sexuality, don't question anything.
Yep.
And that keeps the status quo going, and that's what keeps us at odds with each other.
Yeah.
Um, and that's what keeps us denying other people their humanity and their agency and their full potential as well. And that's
Right.
men and women, and
Yeah.
all, and like you said, across all spectrums of life. These are things that need to be just talked about, and the lines need to be pushed
Yes.
always.
Yes. Well, speaking of that, talk a little bit about I think there's a whole different set of both challenges and opportunities, wielding the pen as a columnist. Your work at Washington Post, you mentioned Men's Health. First of all, I mentioned inspiration at the top. It's been wonderful to see you be able to engage with a different and wider audience. But I think you would agree that it's a different skill set. It's a different type of writing. Talk about the challenges and the opportunities and what it's like to have that platform and what comes with that.
Well, first of all, don't ever read the comments on anything you write. That's the thing. You will become disillusioned so quickly.
Yeah,
I like writing for the Post. I like, getting, getting to say things, and as you say, it's a different kind of writing, right?
yeah,
You have 800 words, to say. I drive my editor crazy because he's like, this is 2,000 words, sir. Like, can you please, we only, so
yeah,
it's a restriction that you have to work with. Like, I have to say the thing that I want to say in 800 words. um and you have to really, that's really work, because you have all these points. I'm like, okay, how do I say this thing in 4 words? um
yeah,
and you end up saying, what's great about it is that the thing that you hedge what's great about the restriction is that the thing that you hedge on saying, the thing that you try to couch in language and try to like maybe back off a little bit, you have to just say it, because you only have so many words.
yeah.
Like today, I wrote one about Beyonce, and the country album that just dropped like today. It's amazing. You should buy it. But I wrote all this stuff about, the Black contribution to music and country music in general. And my editor was like, this is too many words. So in the end, I wrote, all American music is Black music, period. you know, and that's the thing I really wanted to say in the first
Yeah.
place. But
Yeah.
you do this thing where you don't want to say something too strongly, or you don't want to, but sometimes having that limitation really makes you say the thing that you want to say. Um, the platform itself, I write it and I forget about it, because in the beginning of my tenure at the Post, like, I was reading the comments. Oh my God, you know, and I was literally like afraid, that there
Bet.
were there were so many people out there who are so full of vitriol and hate. And as writers, we know this thing. You can read five different comments telling you how amazing you are, and
Yeah.
then one that tells you suck, and
Yep.
you're going to focus on that one that tells you that you suck.
Yep.
But I like doing it. They pretty much let me say the things I want to say. I like pitching. you know my editor is I think of the Superman, and the or Lou Grant. you know
Yeah.
these gruff like editors, like he's that to like in a nutshell. Like,
Yeah.
this is not good. Like, write it again. I like the fast pace of it, but yeah, it's a cool gig, and I'm gonna keep it for as long as I can.
Right on. And I'm assuming, part of what we do, right? Whether it's writing a memoir, having a social media profile, ultimately, or I should say, the types of writing that you do, people of our ilk, as opposed to say genre fiction or something where, commercial aspirations are paramount. We're trying to initiate dialogue. It doesn't mean we're getting people to agree,
Mm.
but it does mean moving that ball forward, however incrementally. And I think having a major platform on an op-ed obviously comes with a certain amount of responsibility. But I love that you've leaned into the freedom that provides in terms of letting you cover. If I were to try to describe what you do and what your voice is it's you're kind of an cultural ambassador, right? You're talking about race, you're talking about sex, you're talking about education, etc. And there shouldn't be boundaries on those things, but you're, in my opinion, not so humbly, your purview is much bigger because you contain multitudes. So I'm sure that's a challenge for you, but a benefit for the people that are reading this stuff.
Well, I mean, I love that you call me an ambassador. I do have a cape that I wear around my house, and a crown, but it's from Burger King, but whatever. Um, no, I mean, I just try not to. Honestly, I try not to think about it that much.
Yep.
Um, you know, and that goes along with the whole idea of not reading the comments, not reading reviews. Because, and it's not because I'm like, a shrinking violet, or anything like that. It's because, if I let a review or a comment, or even if it's good, like, get in, like then it's going to change. I feel like it changes something, like it shifts something in you, and you're not, and then you're writing towards that, whether it be good or bad. Like, Disha, feel y'all.
Yeah.
She told me, like, don't ever write for your bad faith reader. Don't ever, or something like to
Yeah.
those lines. She always gives me really good advice. She's like, don't ever write towards the readers who are just going to read you in bad faith.
Right.
And I think, by the same token, you can't write for people who like the last thing you wrote. Really, really like the last thing you wrote. Like, I sort of get an idea and I try to be faithful to it, and work in a vacuum, of what I want to say. Sometimes it does not work.
Sure.
Um, and sometimes it fails miserably, but it's like a disease. I can't stop doing it. It's like a sickness. I can't stop writing stuff. Ugh.
And inevitably we get down to craft, however we try to skirt around it. And you're giving great advice for writers of any level, any degree of proficiency. But this notion of testing boundaries, I think we ultimately are trying to scratch some itch, some metaphysical itch that only we can do. And I think the writing itself has to cure that, or itch that, scratch that, because if we are writing to our existing fans or the haters, we're immediately diluting kind of the pure voice. And I think we're also not allowing ourselves the opportunity for discovery even within ourselves.
Yeah, like I'm working on my second book now, and luckily I have a really great editor and really great publisher, because a lot of places would just want, since the first book did good. I'm a writer. Since the first book did good, a lot of places would just be like, okay, write part two of that book, you
Right.
know. And I sort of said, like, well, I don't really want to do that. I don't. There's really not a whole much more of my life that I want to talk about. So I was allowed to exercise a new muscle, and it's not easy, and I'm learning a lot. And I guess that's the whole point of it, you know. I tell my kids all the time, like, if you believe exactly what your parents believe, like, you're doing something wrong, like,
Yeah.
So so it's a learning process, like all of it, the writing, the getting up in the morning, the going out and doing stuff. It's all a learning process.
Totally. And it all feeds the writing, it feeds the narrative, it feeds our brand, all of that good stuff. So you already answered one of my final questions, which was what's next. So that's very good news. That's very exciting news. And it's actually an interesting segue, because I was going to ask you specifically, and now I think you really can dive into this. The notion of writing memoir, there is an element of operating without a net. I think we all would agree. And I say this facetiously. I've mentioned it a lot of my own kind of engagement. In some instances, depending on the integrity of the writer, the memoir might be more fiction and the novel is totally based on real characters. But that aside, the form of memoir, at least the unwritten contract, is this is the unvarnished, this is an attempt at the truth, whether it gets there or not. Because, of course, anyone that experiences a situation might say, I was there and that's wrong. It's all about perception. But with a memoir, we're attempting to tell our story, or a story filtered. And so that, plus the teaching, plus the op-ed writing, you're putting yourself out there, which is a very different skill set. I think more vulnerability than, say, a novelist or maybe even a poet. But talk a little bit about those tensions, or again, the opportunities that provides.
Well, oh gosh, I think it's definitely been, a learning process. I was so excited to have a book deal. I didn't think that I was ever gonna be a writer. Like, it wasn't anything that was even like I was thinking about. Like, I went back to school after I went to rehab, just simply because I needed something to do with my time other than drink, you know?
Yeah,
Um, so I was like, I'm gonna go back to school, maybe I'll figure something out.
yeah,
And I just started writing, and that kind of like caught on. And then I got a book deal, which was crazy to me. And I was so like scared that I just wrote it. And I didn't think of that people would read it. Like I didn't think of the ramifications of like,
Yep.
putting your life out there. I get a lot of, the most rewarding thing has been that I got a lot of people from like all walks of life,
Mhm.
saying that they relate. When I really thought my experience was that of just a black gay boy, right?
Yeah.
And all kinds of people have talked to me about the thematic elements with which they relate.
Yep.
Isolation, depression, not feeling good enough, self-esteem, etc. So that's been the great part of it. The not so great part of it has been like there are people who kind of think they know you after they have read your book. And there's been some inappropriate stuff. I got a lot of my email address was like super available. Like all you had to do was Google me after the book was released because I didn't know again, I didn't really wasn't really
Sure.
thinking that people were going to read it.
Yep.
So people Googled me and they got my email address. I got emails you wouldn't believe, from people in the guise of I'm going to help you not be gay anymore,
Oh boy.
or or just downright hatefulness, and a lot of kind ones as well. So putting yourself out there, it kind of depends on what you choose to focus on, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people will understand what you're trying to do and what you're trying to say, and a lot of people won't. They're what Disha calls your bad faith reader, you know, or they just don't like the way you write. Like, you know,
Yeah.
um, I I went home for Thanksgiving or something last year. It was one of the bigger holidays, and my mother completely innocently said like, "Oh, so and so read your book," and I was like, "Oh, that's great." My mom was like, "She hated it." I mean, and for a second I was like, "Well, fuck her," but
Right.
like at
Right.
the same time, I was like, "Well, you're not going to appeal to everybody," but I do feel a little bit. I feel unburdened to a degree
Yeah.
if everybody knows that your insecurities and like the bad stuff you did, and that you're a drug addict, and like all those kinds of things. Like there is kind of a I tell my students all the time that thing that you don't want to write is probably the thing that you should write, because that's where the connection is, oftentimes.
For sure. And yeah, I was just gonna say, I was just gonna add a cherry on that beautiful Sunday and just say, everyone is, or most people we find are either the most put together that have their own private, demons, or everyone's battling. And I think, in the 21st century, it isn't just job insecurity or sexual insecurity or, financial. We're all battling because we're all, to a varying extents, our lives are online. Our lives are a story in ways that 20, 30 years ago were unimaginable.
Yeah,
So I do want to say I think it takes a tremendous amount of courage, artistically and otherwise, to be willing and able to be real and put forth words that are invariably going to invite scorn and vitriol, but also, gosh, the payoff of connecting with people that, whether you hear it or not, and I'm glad you hear it, I'm not surprised at all that you do hear it, but the people who it's helping, it is starting those dialogues. It might be starting internal dialogues with a reader, or someone that can buy that book for someone that might need it. That's all how we advance, these causes we talk about. It's kind of walking the walk and not just having slogans.
absolutely. Like Rajiv Mohidir, who wrote Anti-Man, which is a really great book. Like he said, you never know who you might save, in the telling of your story. And what's great is that I don't know that I've saved anyone, but I do have really wonderful people who come up to me, or who write to me, and they say like, like I thought I was the only one, or I thought, I was alone in feeling this way, or because I write a lot of dirt about myself, like in the book. Like I'm not super kind to myself when I look back and look at some of the things I did and some of the things I said and how I
Yep.
treated some people. But it was all motivated from this real place of like self-loathing, I
Yep.
think. A lot of it was. Some of it was just plain selfishness, but I think when you put your flaws on the page too, like you are saying, okay, here I am. Like, it's not you that's a horrible, just a horrible person. Like, we all do horrible things and we all do really wonderful things. So, and I think that's what people are relating to.
Yeah, and it evinces this capacity for growth, which again on artistic levels is laudable, but on cultural levels, I think the cliches kind of present themselves, but it's lead by example. Be willing to, if you're going to critique the world, probably should critique yourself first. You talk about, the students. I felt like when I went to college, there were you could with men, you could really the line of demarcation were the people that would go to college and some way, somehow would change. And then you saw the people that did maybe change and get exposed to different things. And then they would immediately go back to their hometown. And it was as if they never went to college. And I think that example on a societal level are the kind of tides that we're fighting against. Like it's
Yeah.
safer to retreat, even if it's self-defeating, to retreat back into what's known and what's familiar. What we're talking about with your writing and our just general interrogation of maleness is this notion of time is changing. So if you don't embrace it, you're going to get left behind. But if you want to join the party, you're going to find voices that hear you, want you to be heard, and will advocate for you. It might be painful, but you've got to be willing to make the first move.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, like I said, like, I do see some every once in a while. Like I do see some students who come, from a smaller town and like male students, and they really do expect it to be like it was for them in high school.
Yeah.
And you do see like a a real you see the I don't know if it's disillusionment, but the surprise, when it's not. Um, they usually end up leaving. But here's the other thing, and this is my own prejudice that I want to talk about. When I first started teaching, I was teaching like English Comp, which is a class that all the freshmen had to take. So I
Yeah.
was getting a lot of like, you get a, it's not just right now I teach like creative writing, so you have to elect to take that,
That's
right?
right.
But
Yeah.
before I was getting like everybody, like, because they had to take the class. And so I got a lot of what we would call, or what people would call jocks, in my
Yeah.
classroom. And I was like, I was surprised because I retreated into a 15-year-old Brian. Like, I hated them. They would come in with their like, football stuff and their whatever. And I'd be like, oh, this again.
Yeah.
But what I found out is that I was completely wrong. In some cases I wasn't, but in most cases I was, because a lot of these young men were really interested in writing. A lot of them, I was so shocked when I found out that one of my students, not only was he in football, but he was in theater. And not just theater, Sean, musical theater. Like he was up there singing and dancing at night and like playing football as well.
Yeah.
So that really, first of all, showed me that, okay, first of all, you got to get off of your high horse about this sometimes.
Yeah.
And also, the world is changing. And he wrote stories about like not only was he in musical theater, like his football friends were in musical theater as well. They were like in Boston. I'm like, what the hell's going on in Boston?
Right.
Is there some sort of cultural revolution taking place in Boston? Um, but it's a process. I'm still working on my ideas around it, and also I don't want anybody to walk away from you and I talking thinking that I don't still struggle with this like man thing. You
Yeah.
know, there are certain things that I won't do because it looks girly. There are certain things I won't wear because they make me feel girl. I mean, it's entrenched, like it's ingrained.
Yeah.
Um, you know, one night when I was waiting for the bus and across the street, there we have locally we have a drag queen named Marsha Mello. And Marshmallow is like, probably 6 feet tall with it without heels. Um, and then heels, and then she's like 7 feet tall. And then the wig adds another 3 feet, right? So she is this presence, and she was standing at the bus stop across the street from me, in like full drag, full makeup,
Yeah.
wig, heels, dress, like, and she was standing there waiting for a bus. you know? And I thought, how masculine, and I don't mean that in the sense of the word,
Yeah.
like the sense we normally take it, but like
Yeah.
how brave, how strong, how, and I mean, it wasn't like people weren't yelling shit at her. She was just like, whatever,
Right.
But I thought those are the qualities that we attribute to male presenting people, and we give them like all these accolades for, going against the grain and being strong and like
Right.
whatever. But
Yeah.
I'm like, that's probably one of the braver things I've seen, is and when you see, particularly in a small city like Pittsburgh,
Right.
um, that still has a lot of problems around like race and gender and sex and sexuality and like all that stuff. Like,
Sure.
um, and that's when it really sort of dawned on me, like there are people who are going against the grain like every day. And
Yeah.
there are some people who simply by existing are have to go against the grain every single day.
That's
Like
right.
I'm a cis man, there are only so many, I mean, there are obstacles that I face, but they're certainly not as
Yeah.
numerous and as potentially dangerous as other people have to face. So yeah, I forgot where I was going with that, but I thought about Marshmallow and my mind just went like,
I love it. Well, and I think it brings us somewhat full circle in the sense of, it's almost a buzzword, but there's real power behind this notion of cultivating and advocating for empathy. And what that ultimately comes down to, right, is this idea that, yeah, I mean, we all are more alike than we're, different, but everyone's got a struggle. And it's probably incumbent on anyone with any sort of privilege to be cognizant of it, check that, and maybe extend a little more courtesy, a little more awareness and understanding. That also helps stimulate the dialogues. But I appreciate that you mentioned, because I'll lift my hand and be counted too. Far from complete. It's where I think we're all works in progress, artistically, culturally, and as the human beings that we are as unique individuals. Like that's the whole point. And I'm really glad you said that, because I would feel remiss if I didn't, underline that. Like all of us, this is life's work. And I think
yeah.
the minute you think you're done, you start to stagnate.
Yeah, I mean, Disha calls me all the time on my sexism. Like I will, I mean, and I get rebukes, when I have said or done something sexist, and I'm like, I can't believe that I wrote a whole book about this, and like I still do this shit,
Yeah.
and still sometimes get defensive about it. My women friends, I thank God that they put up with me sometimes, because like I was raised by a man who believed that men were supposed to be in charge of anything, and who used God to buttress that idea, you
Yes.
know. Um, one of the well, I'm not going to say this because I just wrote it, so I don't want I just but I'll say it. You could read it in my book.
There you
Um, but yeah, like he and and all these years like bucking him, or anything that he believed, I still am surprised to find that it's still in there, you
go. Yeah.
know. It's still
Yeah.
very much in there, and I have to recognize it. I have to swallow my pride sometimes and be like, okay, you're right, And also, you just don't want to fight with Disha. She will fuck you up.
Yeah, folks, we're talking about the Queen. Disha Philia helped bring Brian and I together. So she is always facilitating and checking and making sure that all of us are in our lanes. I think we all look to the great Disha for guidance. Um,
Absolutely.
Brian, I think, and I knew you'd do this. You never count on anything, but I knew talking to you, we would reinforce, how we define maleness, how we work toward developing empathy, but also, again, on creative and human levels, talking about this notion of struggle, work, and reminding everyone out there, even when you have written a wonderful, critically acclaimed book, you've not arrived. You have reached a pinnacle that very few of us will reach. So full props and recognizing that. But for real writers and real human beings, it's waiting, realizing you wake up every day and there's more work to do. There's more people
Absolutely.
you can bring along. There's better ways to improve yourself. And that, I think, is how we can remain optimistic, in challenging times. If we're all proceeding with intention, good things are going to happen.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I think our work here is done. But Brian, I thank you. It's always a joy to talk to you. I appreciate you taking the time. I am absolutely delighted that book number 2 is going to be in our world soon, and we will celebrate that accordingly when it happens. How do people find you? The happy folks that are listening, aside from going and buying this book, how can people look you up online?
They should buy all the books because I want a pool. No. Well, I mean, there's my ridiculous Facebook page. Like, don't come with any nonsense because I don't argue with people on social media anymore. I have an Instagram page. I don't do a whole lot with social media anymore. But if you want to, I don't know, if you want me to speak somewhere, do something, you can go to brianbroome.com and talk to my good friend Anya, who books me. And what else? I think that's it. Or you can catch me at my coffee shop. Just people watching and drinking way too much coffee. So, yeah,
Well, to be continued. Tremendous pleasure. I'm happy to call you a friend and a source of inspiration. So we shall continue this dialogue, I hope, anytime. So
ab-
all the best. Thank you for being here, folks. Brian Broome, once again. If you haven't already, come on, go get a copy and get one for someone else. It will advance the dialogue. Thank you for tuning in to Some Things Considered. Thanks for checking us out. To find out more or be a guest, go to seanmurphy.net. Remember, we're obsessed with story and celebrating creativity, and we're here to advocate for the arts by any means necessary. So drop us a line, get involved, and support our creatives who are the lifeblood of our culture. We'll see you again soon. Be well. Thanks for tuning in to Some Things Considered. Find out more, including how to be a guest, at seanmurphy.net. Reminder, we are obsessed with story and celebrating creativity. Also, we're here to advocate for the arts by any means necessary. Drop us a line, get involved, and support our creatives who are the lifeblood of our culture. I'm Sean Murphy. See you on the next episode of Some Things Considered.